the Maliheh Paryavi podcast. I'm your host, Maliheh Paryavi. This season, I bring you real conversations with inspiring women leaders who are norm breakers and pioneers. Join my guests and I as we explore how to realize our dreams, become the leaders we deserve to be, and transform the world both within and around us. Our journey together begins right now. I'm here with the amazing Angela Duckworth, and I'm so excited to be recording my very first podcast.
This is great. This is so fun. I'm honored.
Thanks for being here. Thanks for having me and inviting me to the Character Lab and for agreeing to come on this ride with me.
My seatbelt is fastened. I'm ready to go.
Let's dive in. So I want to start with a quote that's on the cover of your book by Daniel Gilbert. For our listeners who may not know, he's a professor at Harvard, professor of psychology. And he says, psychologists have spent decades searching for the secret of success, but Duckworth, you, is the one who found it.
That's what the quote says,
Yeah.
and I think it's high praise. I can certainly say more about what I think about success, but yeah, I was very, Dan Gilbert's a great person. He's a role model for me, so I was really, really grateful and pleased that he was enthusiastic.
So I want to ask you, based on your research, what is the secret to success?
This idea that success could be one thing, grit or anything else, is something that every time there's a new year or you have a birthday and you're like, okay, this is going to be different, everyone's always looking for the one thing. Yeah. It's not one thing, and it's not just grit that matters. For example, luck matters, and I say this in the book too, but there is a lot in your life that is not something that you could anticipate. I think about my husband and I meeting. Gosh, I could have met him or not met him, and if fate had gone a different way, my entire life would be different. And so many things actually are like that. So there's luck in life, and that's not grit. And there's also opportunity in life that is not equal among people. So even if you're really gritty and you have very few opportunities, you're not going to succeed as much as somebody who has every opportunity, even if they have less grit. So I don't want to overstate the importance of grit to success. But that all said, all those qualifications given, I do think when you look at people who change the world, particularly for the better, but one could argue change the world in any way, they do have this combination of passion and perseverance for the long term, and they may have many other things as well. Luck, I mentioned, opportunity, and even talent, which I talk about in the book as not being the same thing as grit. But grit is a common denominator.
Which you define as passion and perseverance over long-term goals.
That's what I like to use the word to mean, yeah.
So how did you determine this? How did you determine that grit is a key element amongst the things that we have control over? Because yes, income levels, your initial endowment, what you're born with, the support, the luck, the opportunities, we don't have much control over. But grit is something that we may be able to work with. So how did you come up with this?
When I got to graduate school in psychology, I was 32, which is, roughly a decade later than most people think you're supposed to show up to graduate school. I mean, I had already had a kid. I was pregnant with my second one. I was, with my husband living in Philadelphia, so I could only apply to one graduate school because it was, not possible for me to just fly everywhere in the country because my husband had just moved to Philadelphia for his job, so we were both there. Anyway, I didn't have a lot of advantages in terms of being young and knowing what I wanted. I did have what I had gained in those 10 years from graduating from college all the way to graduate. What was I doing? Well, a lot of that time I was working with kids. I was teaching, I was running a summer school, and in those years working with kids, I got to see some of those kids be wildly successful and other kids be surprisingly unsuccessful, even though they were all in my care. They were all in my classroom. We're all reading the same book. We all got the same homework assignment. What was the difference? Well, like I said at the very beginning of our conversation, I don't think you can boil anybody's life down to one word or one idea, but I would say that I noticed that some kids were much better at consistently coming back from setbacks and failure and getting up again, being resilient. They also, these kids who ended up being surprisingly successful for me, they had a kind of consistency of purpose. I mean, they didn't let their motivation go up and down wildly like a roller coaster. They were able able to maintain their focus on things that were important to them. And so that was the very beginning of thinking about grit. Now, like I said, there are other things that matter. I also study self-control and delay of gratification, so it's not that grit is the only thing. But in general, the most, maybe important thing that parents and teachers and anyone who wants to be successful themselves would want to know is that these things are not the same thing as talent. They're not the same things as being, say, innately gifted or, oh, everything comes easy to you. And for many of us, that's encouraging, because if we aren't naturals at things right off the bat, it doesn't mean we're going to be failures. It may mean that what distinguishes us in the end is not that things came easily to us, but that we worked harder.
What you talk about also, deliberate practice, and how applying that can really get people over hurdles and get them to really learn about anything that they're curious about. So can you tell me about that?
Yeah, and I'd love to hear your insights from your perspective, your experience as well. So Anders Ericsson was a great scientist. I like to joke with him that he's the world expert on world experts, because Anders Ericsson has spent his entire career studying people who are truly world-class at what they do. So he studies prima ballerinas and people who win the international Scrabble tournament. Anders and I studied the champions of the National Spelling Bee. He studies World Cup soccer players, mathematicians, radiologists. And the reason why he studies such diverse domains of human expertise is that his project is to understand what these domains have in common. In other words, when you go from an amateur to an expert in ballet or math or radiology, what is the same about those things? And what he's found is that everybody starts off in fields really as an amateur, not knowing much. Even those you could argue are gifted, they don't know what they're doing at the beginning. And then you progress, you get better. And what he's found is that experts are distinguished by the quality and the quantity of their practice. He calls it deliberate practice, the quality practice that has as its features having a very specific intention about what it is that you're working on, typically with the help of a coach. Very few people are able to say, okay, this is exactly what I should be working on today. Then,
or a teacher or an advisor.
Yeah, when he uses the word coach, I think he means it very inclusively. So teacher, a mentor, a peer, right? So, but anybody who's playing that role of thinking strategically about what you should be doing next. And then you have to, of course, try. You really have to be 100% absorbed and engaged in practice, which makes it very difficult because you're trying to do something you can't yet do, but with all of your effort. And then the part that I think as a psychologist might be the most difficult, which is to really look at your feedback with the kind of lack of ego that I think is so hard for many of us, because when someone tells you, hey, I think you could speak a little slower, or, oh, I think you could actually speak a little faster, or I just don't understand the first paragraph of this essay, our natural reaction is to be defensive. These experts that Anders Ericsson studies are able to do this kind of practice over and over and over again, day in and day out for years. And that is what Anders determines to be so very special about them, that they can become those rare people who are at the top of their fields.
And something else that's doing this type of practice and actually want to be an expert in something, you need to be able to embrace challenges and welcome challenges. And tell me a little bit about that.
Idea of a challenge is a word that's kind of, it's interesting. It's kind of an emotional word, but it most of the time I think can be thought of as a positive thing, right? Challenging is a word that we might use to think about something that we know is going to be hard, but it has a kind of a thrilling excitement to it. I think actually that's the way ideally we should approach new projects, starting a new podcast, or, for me, writing this book was a huge challenge. I'm running a nonprofit now that's enormously challenging. You should have a kind of, not should, but I think it can be very helpful to have an approach orientation to challenge, to kind of embrace it and feel titillated, to feel sort of excited, like there's a thrill, like you're not really sure what's going to happen. An opposite emotional reaction is to fear challenge. And in fact, one could argue that stress is fear or feeling that you're overwhelmed. Both challenge and stress are about things that you haven't done before yet. You're wondering, it's going to be difficult. But on the challenge side of the coin, you're like, wow, what's going to happen? I'm going to learn something. Is it going to be great? And on the stress or the fear side of it, it's, you're sort of shrinking away. I think the people that I've studied tend to have more of a challenge framework, or mindset about what they're about to do than a stress, mindset. They're kind of looking forward to something they can't yet do, and they are embracing that. And in fact, when we look at kids who are given a choice between, a really challenging game and an easy game that is, maybe going to be less rewarding. Like we might even say, like, okay, you can get a few coins if you do the hard one. You can get more coins than if you do the easy one. Kids who are grittier tend to choose the more challenging task.
I definitely relate to this. Personally, I find that I embrace challenges in a way that's exciting to me because I have a safety net for myself that a worst case scenario, I'll grow from this, or I will learn something from this, and not being really attached to that result and not really fearing failure as much, and seeing that as an opportunity for growth and development. I think the ability to really embrace challenge has to do a lot with your relationship and how you really perceive failure.
I think you're hitting it right on the head, or at least the psychological, the situation where if you don't do well, right? So if you do something, you choose the harder task and don't get all the right answers, how do you process that? And if you're really thinking about learning, then you can relax, because how many days have you had that you can say, like, I didn't learn anything today? You learn every day, and maybe you learn more on the bad days than you learn on the good days, as painful as that may be. So that learning mindset, which Carol Dweck's research on growth mindset is, of course, very popular. I'm sure we'll talk about it at some point in this conversation. But before she wrote her book on growth mindset, she was well known in psychology for studying two different kinds of goals. This is very related to her more recent work. On the one hand, you could have a learning goal. That's what I heard when you described thinking about something that, you might fail at, but you're thinking basically about what you're going to learn, versus thinking about the same exact task, but thinking about performance, thinking about, okay, how do I get to as close as perfect on this as possible?
Or how do I get better?
The how do I get better would be more of a learning goal.
Okay.
But the performance goal is like, how do I not get any wrong? How do I, here's an example. During this podcast, I could have a learning goal, which could be like, I want to, Angela, speaking for myself, I want to learn as much as I can. Maybe I'll take a few risks, and maybe things won't turn out as well for this podcast, but I will learn more. A performance goal would just say, like, how can I give my best performance? And I don't have to learn anything. Your motives, just when you think about that, are always mixed, right? When I'm sitting here in the podcast, my goal personally is not just to learn everything I can, because I do want to give you a good performance, so it's satisfying and useful.
That's mutual.
Okay, good, right. So same for you. So I think we have to recognize that we have these conflicting motives. If you can keep your learning goals at the forefront of your conscious awareness, it will, I think, help you deal with failure. It will help you take more risks. And it's a wonderful way to live life, to basically wake up every morning, get out of bed, and be looking forward to something that you're going to learn that day.
Today was one of those days for me, because I woke up like, I cannot believe I am recording a podcast episode.
It's very exciting.
Never saw myself doing something like this. I'm driving up from DC, and I'm like, with all this recording gear and microphones, like,
it's crazy. I love it.
It's exciting, because I don't know how this is gonna go, and I have all these notes written down that I'm not even looking at. But I'm just like, I'm just gonna go with the flow, and I'm gonna enjoy, and again, get feedback, and hopefully improve as time goes by. And we got to start from somewhere. And again, that learning mindset, I think, has always helped me kind of overcome whenever I have that anxiety creeping up, because it can creep up, and it's not like you have that mindset and it's fixed.
Right.
And recognizing that we need to adapt, and it's okay if some fear and anxiety does come up, and just sit with that and then reorient yourself.
Yeah, I think we should forgive ourselves when, we might have like fear or anxiety. We're like, oh no, now not only do I feel anxious or fearful, now I feel bad about feeling fearful or anxious. We've all experienced pessimistic thinking, and I think one thing I like about mindfulness, which, I don't know if you have any kind of mindfulness practice. I'm not a serious meditator, but I think one insight, since so many people have now heard about mindfulness and its benefits, is that The core, I think, of mindfulness is a non-judgmental awareness of the present. And if you can observe, like, hey, there I go being a little pessimistic, like, oh, I feel like I'm a little afraid. I feel like I'm doubting myself. If you can kind of sit with that in a non-judgmental way, instead of, when I was a younger woman, I remember in my 20s, every time I would think something bad, I would then get into this tailspin about feeling bad, and then you just, sort of spiral downwards. So I think to kind of just be mindful and be like, oh, I have a little fixed mindset, or I can be pessimistic, or sometimes I catastrophize, and to not let that burn out of control and just be like, okay, I noticed that about myself. But most people feel that way sometimes.
And recognizing that these are just thoughts, and they only get energized if we put energy and focus to them, if we start believing them. I thank my mind for sharing, and I'm like, okay, how can I regroup? Every time these thoughts come up, and as you know, I work as an advisor to women in leadership, and I find that as more accomplished some women get, the more they beat themselves up if they have any kind of self-doubt, because they think, well, I've come so far, and why am I doubting myself now? And then they start thinking maybe I'm not good enough, and maybe I'm really not as confident as I'm supposed to be, and they have all these expectations. But self-doubt is something it's a thought. It comes in your mind, and you can just release it, or you can engage with it and make it mean something, and you don't have to do that. And it's something that I feel like as long as we have a pulse, like we feel that everybody thinks these things. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast is I feel like oftentimes people read these impressive bios and see these amazing people who are making such an impact and are so inspiring, and they have this perception that they have it all figured out, or they never have self-doubt, or they never think negative thoughts, or they never get anxiety when they're about to take on something new. I mean, I had to meditate for an hour this morning. I did my prayers. I wrote them in my journal. Like, I had to set myself up to show up today. So, but oftentimes people really have that expectation or that perception. So I want everyone to hear, Angela Duckworth, the winner of, the MacArthur Genius Grant, saying that I think it would be comforting for people to hear that self-doubt, and anxiety and fear, they're part of the process.
Yeah, they're part of the process of life, right? No, but you're exactly right. I do think that women tend to experience this maybe a little more often or a little bit more intensely than men, but I am sure we all know that men also experience these things. It's also true, I think you're right, there's this kind of paradox. The more accomplished you become as a woman, sometimes, the less leeway you give yourself for any kind of deviation from perfection. And I have two girls at home. They're 17 and 15, and I really hope for them that they can feel like their purpose in life is not to be perfect, but just to try to do their best and to do better, of course, in the future than in the past. But I can see it already with them as they become young women, that in their head almost like they have a belief that, like, oh, if you don't get everything right, then somehow like things fall apart. So it's a message that we all have to work on, I think, and I'm glad you're reminding people.
When I face a setback, or when things don't go the way that I wanted them to, I've never really seen it as failure. I've kind of see it as an opportunity to grow. What I would see as a failure is if I didn't learn from that experience, but I don't see the experience itself as a failure.
So have you always been like that? I mean, that's a wonderful way to be, but for many people, they were like, wow, how did you get that way?
I mean, I don't know. I think I thought about that as I was preparing for this. I don't know if I've always been this way. I think I grew up in a family and a culture where I was always told everything happens for a reason. There's some greater wisdom. So for me, it was like, okay, what is the wisdom? So I had this curiosity of trying to figure out, what am I supposed to learn from this? How can I grow from this? And it's mostly having also the ability to create space for that growth, to really sit with that discomfort of, this really hurts and this didn't go the way I wanted, but how can I learn from it? Instead of jumping immediately to the next thing to try to forget about that, I see people doing that with relationships or, or anything like that, just sitting and really not necessarily having a growth mindset, but a growth practice or a growth way of being, a growth-oriented lifestyle, I suppose. That my life is really about learning and growing as a person. So if I had to think of where this originated from, I would probably credit the culture I grew up in terms of...
Was that your parents, or do you think more like broader
parents,
cultural?
My parents, especially. I mean, I don't want to...
go all Freudian or
But I think in my home, everything, and I would get frustrated sometimes when my mom would say, like it's for the best, like this, there's something behind this. I would get frustrated, but why? Not that I didn't feel the frustration. But I over time, when I started seeing, well, I actually can't, thank God that didn't really happen the way I wanted it to, because it created space for this to happen. And when I started noticing how I'm growing from these situations, it made me sort of become more curious about the lessons.
So when you failed as a little kid, I mean, we all fail, like we fall down or we don't get a good grade or we don't get on the team we want. What was your mom or your family's reaction to that?
I mean, not to get me wrong, like failure was not an option in my family.
Interesting, yeah.
It was like strive for perfection, or my dad would say, my daughter is a perfectionist, and he would be very so proud of that. And he has no idea it's taken me 20 years to try to wash that off or try to kind of because it can also be very crippling, and I've struggled with that. Especially through graduate school, doing the PhD program, it really brought up all of these things, and I really had to. But I sat with it. I was like, how can I grow from this, or what this isn't working, and how can I make this work, or how can I use an opportunity to grow and as a person and evolve. But at the same time, when there was a family crisis and something went really wrong that seemed out of our control, that message was there. There's wisdom behind it. There's a reason. So maybe I kind of put it all together.
Is that religious? There's wisdom behind it? There's a reason? Like, was it a divine...
My family is Muslim, and so that's a very central component of the faith and how we were raised, and like trusting in a higher power and trusting that there is really wisdom behind it, and we are taken care of at the end of the day. But I think because I've always been someone who's been curious about human behavior, I've also always been like dissecting my own behavior and studying this and looking into how can I improve, because if something wasn't working, I always felt maybe it should be better, or it could be easier.
Yeah, I think these ideas that are obviously, so there's two things that I hear, which I resonate with myself, but on the one hand, a kind of constant striving towards excellence and perfection, and then on the other hand, which seems to be in tension, which is like, well, there's a reason behind things, and if things don't work out, there's something to learn, and it may be for the best. In a sense, these are in tension, because like on the one hand, striving for excellence or perfection means like there is a right way and there's a wrong way, and there's a better outcome and a worse outcome. But the second impulse is to say like things happen and there's benefits that are probably not obvious to you, and maybe there's even a divine reason for that. But I feel both of those things in myself, these two seeming counter currents, and I myself feel like every day, I mean, I am incredibly hard to work with, I think, because I will be writing a paper with someone and it'll be done, it'll be completely done, it'll even be accepted for publication, and then I look at it again, I'm like, this is terrible. Actually, I use much more vulgar language, and I'm like, this is terrible, and I'm going to rewrite everything, and my co-authors are like, what the heck, it's done. And I'm like, no, it's not good enough. I'm not going to put my name on it. So on the one hand, I have this constant striving for perfection. On the other hand, I think you're right. When things don't work out, when you get rejected from the journal, or just, things don't work, I think if you have this, feeling like you can learn from anything, and I know these are, in myself, sometimes in tension, but I think they're certainly compatible enough to exist in the same person, which is why I think you have both those intuitions.
I mean, I don't know. I'm definitely a work in progress.
Yeah, it's my favorite hashtag, work in progress, as we all are.
So I want to go back to the concept of grit for a moment, and how that relates to goal setting. And what are your thoughts on that? Like, how is the goal setting something that can help with developing grit or?
One thing that I've noticed about these people that strike me as having unusual stamina about their goals, unusually consistent purposes in life, and work ethic and resilience, is that they seem in most cases to have a very clear goal hierarchy. And so hierarchy of course suggests that there are layers, and in fact when you have a really gritty person, it's like they have a top level identity or purpose, a goal that rules over all the other goals. In many cases, people are able to articulate it in a sentence, I mean, in a few words. And I have my own worked out. When I was writing the book, I thought to myself, do I have one of those top level goals? It's like at the top of the pyramid that gives meaning and purpose and direction to everything else that I do. And it took me a little while to figure it out, but I was just sharpening the words, I think, for something that had been there before, and that is to say that my top level goal is to use psychological science to help kids thrive. And when I think about everything I do, including sitting down and talking to you, or like checking my email, or reading a paper, pretty much everything in my professional life does actually meet that goal in some way, shape, or form. I have a personal goal hierarchy as well, of course. I'm a mom and I have a goal of being a good mother, but I think that it's very helpful in terms of thinking about grit, is to think about, could I define for myself what I want my life to be about? And can I line up my daily activities so that they're really pointing towards that goal? So yes to goal setting, but when I think about grit, I think about goal setting kind of a grand way, which is like, could you do goal setting for your life, just for this week or 2019?
I think I suffered from the opposite problem for a long time.
Funny, yeah.
Because I grew up in a family where my father would always be like, serve the world, do good, with all these very grand macro level, think of ways to serve, think of ways to contribute. And so I struggled with learning how to set the mid-level and the low-level goals, and feeling like none of them measured up to getting me to that, or feeling like I have to get to that big goal sooner, or pushing myself too hard at times. And then it took some practice to finally learn how to set these goals, and also learn how to adapt the goals if needed, and I think one of the things I've learned perhaps more recently is how to let go of some goals that I may have set for myself that may not necessarily fit, or may not necessarily be serving me, or may not necessarily be serving that greater purpose that I have for myself, without feeling like I'm quitting or I'm giving up. Or
so what is give me an example of one of those things that you gave up, and then also tell me, if you can, what is it, the top level goal that, or as high as you can articulate it for me.
So I feel like the top level goal for me, I feel like maybe I have two level, even the top level goals can get broken down in my mind, because I have this very grand top-level goal of helping improve society and promote human, social, economic, and political development.
Okay.
That covers everything, basically, right? And then one way I feel that I really believe I want to do this is to help individuals become drivers of positive change and feel empowered from within.
Okay.
And within that, in terms of my mid-level goals, I've started, this advisory practice where I work with women in leadership. We keep saying we need more women in leadership, but we leave them up there to fend for themselves without having that support, the technical support, emotional support, and someone who they can have a real safe space to brainstorm with, strategize with, and, so I'm doing that. And then I'm also writing a book about my own personal journey of going through all of these experiences, and I was like, if I can take a risk to be vulnerable, maybe it can help other people who may be struggling with some similar issues, because I've had to kind of undo a lot of this conditioning of being perfect and constantly working and constantly setting these goals. And so I will get into that a little later. And then this podcast is also one of those areas. I was like, this is another medium to kind of send these messages, speaking with experts, and also role models models who are living these living examples of these topics. And within, for example, the podcast, the first thing I had to do was identify the guest I'm curious to talk to, and then it was okay. Now how do I invite them? And going around thinking, who knows who, and how can I get to this person, and how can I get to that person, and how can I, and doing those things, and then preparing the recording equipment and educating myself about this stuff. And then recently I realized this is getting too much. I mean, post-production is not something I'm willing to let that go. I'm willing to outsource. Of course, I will oversee and I will be involved, but I'm realizing I don't have to do it all. It's okay to let go of that. Or for example, it's okay to let go of a guest that someone was telling me, oh, this person would be great, but I didn't really feel curious to talk to that person. But I was like, I can't fake it. I can't fake genuine interest. I mean, they're doing amazing things, but I just feel at this point, I don't know what I would talk to them about. Maybe that will change, but I feel like unless I have a curiosity to talk to someone, I'm not gonna approach. So letting myself be okay with that I don't have to go after every single person, or I don't have to, get it all sorted out immediately. So it's been a process to learn how to let go of things if they're not serving the greater purpose, or if they're not serving me, or if it's something else I thought of doing was, oh, maybe I should start writing articles for magazines and online journals. And I tried that for a day, and I'm not really enjoying this.
Right.
So I'm like, I don't know. If I wanted to do that, I would have gone into academia.
Yeah, right.
Or letting go of academia and letting know, I want to do these things, but I felt that academia wouldn't be my medium of doing this work. So being okay with that.
And let me ask you, because I think this is a great journey, and I think having some clarity about what you're trying to do should, and not to say that it's easy, and maybe your story is a great example of, like, even when you have the insight doesn't mean it makes it easy or that it comes instantaneously, but you were able to give up some things and say, like, okay, no, I'm not going to pursue this guest, no, I'm not going to do the post-production. And then last thing you said was like, okay, I'm not going to pursue academia, right? Which other people could say, well, my top level goal is also development very broadly, but I'm going to do it through being a professor. I'm curious, like, what was it about academia that made you feel like it wasn't the right fit for you, if you can articulate why?
I love learning, and I love consuming research, and I love finding ways of applying it, but I'm not a big fan of producing it. So that
is a very important distinction. People like read a book on neuroscience and they're like, I want to be a neuroscientist. I'm like, oh, it is very different when you're actually running a magnet and running computer code to see what part of the brain is active. It's much more fun for most people to like watch the output than to create the input.
Yeah, so when I got that clarity, I think academia was pretty much out of the way, but it took me a while to be okay with that. Because you spend years in a PhD program kind of being groomed for that world. I felt like I was disappointing my advisors, and it was just really hard for me to kind of let go and be okay with that and be like, oh, but I'm having so much fun doing this kind of stuff. Lord knows where it's going to take me, but it's brought me to life, and I feel happy, and but back in my mind, there's never a thought of, oh, I should be really, pursuing a postdoc right now. And that's gone.
That's gone. That's good. You have evolved. You have matured. Totally. There was a great psychotherapist named Albert Ellis, who was, one of the co-creators of cognitive therapy, and he had a different name for it, and anyway, but he used to say to his clients that he didn't like the word should. I don't either. I think I often was kind of shackled by these ideas of should and ought, and I think it's not that we should. It's not that any of us live a life where there's no shoulds, but I do think questioning what is behind that should, like who says I should, and then interrogating those shoulds, and some of them will dissolve and some of them won't, right? I should be nice to people. Okay, that should is probably going to stay, but you can interrogate your shoulds, and maybe you'll realize like, this should I don't see really has any basis. Like I don't have to become a professor just because I got a PhD.
Yeah, and whether the should translates into a want.
I think having authentic wants.
And giving yourself permission to actually want things, because Again, I grew up in a culture where everything was about doing things for others and serving others, and
Especially being a woman,
your family, especially being a woman. So it really took me sometimes to what do I really want? What do I really enjoy? And giving myself permission to pursue those things and not see myself as this martyr that has to go sacrifice myself for the greater good if I'm not enjoying it. I mean, I am finding a way to serve that greater good, but in a way that also brings me to life.
Yeah.
And I think that was a journey in and of itself for me, to learn how to, okay, there are all these shoulds, there are all these expectations. I don't know if they're the right ones for me. And really sitting with that and like, okay, and identifying which areas of my life am I sticking to those shoulds unnecessarily.
Yeah. Are you still working on any?
I think I've done a really good cleanse.
You got a good cleaning? You've done a good cleaning?
I went through a really good cleanse for about a year.
The life-changing magic of tidying up your shoulds, I guess. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. Like, it was literally even a physical cleanse where I, donated everything. I just really wanted to, what do I really like to wear? Even what do I enjoy wearing? What do I,
It is like the life-changing
magic.
How do
I want to set up what kind of car do I enjoy driving? It went into this, what do I really want instead of what I should have? What is, of course, being mindful of finances and all these other things.
Right.
It's not
Laws,
ethics.
These things also matter.
It's not just whatever you want. It's also, but giving myself permission. Yeah. It's okay to want things that may not fit the conventional expectations that are set before us, and it's okay for me to pursue it and try it. I mean, it may, I may end up doing a podcast, and then this could be the only season, or I may end up doing it more and more, and who knows? Just trying different things to see what feels right and what you enjoy and how it goes. And I know that's also one of the things you work with in the Character Lab, of getting children to cultivate their curiosity and explore their world. And can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, well, we're sitting in Character Lab, so I should talk about Character Lab. So Character Lab is a nonprofit that I had created 6 years ago with two educators, and these two educators were named Dave and Dominic, and they came to the University of Pennsylvania, where I was, I think maybe even just a graduate student at the time, and they came to see my advisor, Marty Seligman, who was, of course, famous, and they said, we don't know what to do with kids beyond a certain point. Like, we do a pretty good job with getting kids to be curious and grateful and self-controlled and successful, but we feel like we've reached kind of a ceiling on what we can do based on our intuition, and we think science might be able to break the ceiling. And Marty thought that was interesting, and I of course loved the idea because I had only gone to graduate school with the purpose of helping kids. So I thought, wow, these are like the two wise men who are here to help me figure out how to do that. So we started Character Lab, and today Character Lab has a two-part mission. One is we would love to see a lot more science on the development of human potential, which we call character development. And we mean very broadly, not just grit, not just self-control, not just curiosity, not just gratitude, not just kindness, really everything. All of those things and more that make us, the best people we can be. So we like to say that we advance the science of character development, and the other half of what we do is to advance the practice of it, to understand not just among the people who are experts, but like the work that you're doing, right? Democratizing or popularizing the science. I write a thought of the week. Every week it's a few hundred words, so you can read it in less than a minute, and it's one scientific insight, usually tied into a personal story or some kind of metaphor, and it is fact-checked by the original scientist who is the leading edge of the work. So unlike anything else that I can think of, this is a weekly dose of psychological wisdom that comes from scientists. So those are the things that Character Lab does, and I'm thrilled to be doing it. But like you said, it has that feeling of the trembling that we all feel about doing something that hasn't been done yet, that you haven't done certainly, because you really have the sense that you're doing something you don't know how to do, which I have every day. I'm like, oh, what the heck are we doing? How are we going to make our budget? And how do you hire people? And what does an org chart look like? These are things that you're not taught in graduate school, as you and I both know. But that's what Character Lab is, and I'm very fortunate to be part of it.
Yeah, and really taking these things that you haven't learned anything about in graduate school and seeing it as learning opportunities, and not feeling like, oh, I need to have all the equipment and all the skills before I even start this thing.
Right.
And I think
Just
that's
start.
what holds a lot of people back, because they think, well, I don't have leadership experience. I don't know what the organizational setup needs to be. I don't know where the funding is going to come from. But if that's something that gets you excited, and you can just start and learn along the way,
There's this great paraphrasing, I have to say, because it's a German poet named Goethe, and there's, a paraphrasing of someone's writing that says, whatever it is you can do or think you can do it. Action has power, magic, and beauty to it. And I think that's great advice, right? Like, just start, right? You'll learn faster if you start and make mistakes along the way than if you sit in your room for 10 years thinking, through every possible maneuver and then getting started. You'll probably be wrong anyway. And the other piece of advice, I think, which we haven't covered so much, is that a lot of people have top-level goals that really they can only accomplish with other people. Mm-hmm. So, a character lab, I'm not, the best person in design. I'm not the best person on finances. I'm not the best person actually even in management and leadership. And I can tell you who those other people are, but there's a whole team here. And I think one of the things about being gritty and achieving a top-level goal in your life is to recognize what your part is going to be, but also recognizing the parts that you don't have to play. Like you said, you're not going to do post-production. Yeah. Great. It doesn't mean that you're not contributing if you're not doing everything.
So as you're talking about the character lab and all the different hats that you're wearing, I know a lot of women leaders face the challenge of managing all the competing demands of their time, on their attention, emotional, mental, and physical energy. And as a female leader yourself, who wears so many hats, being a mom, a wife, CEO of the character lab, a professor, a scholar, and the list goes on, how do you stay sane?
I read a book by Mary Kay. Have you heard of Mary Kay Cosmetics? I mean, this is going back, it's going to date me. But Mary Kay was a female entrepreneur, and she wrote a book with advice, and she was also kind of like of her time. So I would not say that like every piece of advice in that book was something I would take to heart. But she said, when you get your first paycheck, you should see if somebody can help you fulfill some of these other responsibilities, like cleaning or cooking or whatever. So I remember reading that even in graduate school, and I was thinking, when I have a paycheck, I'm going to actually do that. And I get a lot of help. I mean, I have these young women who are, either in law school or on their way to doing something else. And, they're young, ambitious women. So I know when they come and help me, like, wash dishes, it's not because it's part of a career move that is the end move, but that they're making some cash and that they're paying their way through law school or whatever. So I get a lot of help. And that's something which I don't think we can take for granted, because I recognize fully that there are many women, probably most women, who don't have that option. Like, they don't have money in the family budget to pay for somebody else to take on some of these responsibilities. So one way I do it is that I'm just fortunate, right, that I can pay for, my groceries to get delivered. I order them through the internet, and then that saves me 45 minutes that I'd have to go to the supermarket, and I use those 45 minutes to like write a paper, right? So I'm lucky that way. And I would say the second thing, and the last thing I was going to say, is like, it really is not easy, no matter how much luck or help you have. I am somebody who would say, like, well, when my kids were growing up, what would they say if they were on this podcast? And I think they would say that, like, their mom, they liked their mom, but I think they would say that, their mom worked really hard and, maybe didn't play with them as much, or, certainly wasn't around when they came home after school because I was at work. So it's hard. The only thing that may be different in the future, because it's always been hard, I think, for women for all of history, is that now men are feeling it too. I think men, for the first time, we have a generation, like my husband feels the same tension that I think women have felt forever, but he feels badly when he has to work late, or he's working on a Saturday, or, he gets home late for dinner. And I think that it's a good thing that, both men and women are at least sharing that burden of the work-life balance, or the ballet that, so many of us have to try every day to work out. But my kids are reasonably happy people, so I think it wasn't easy. It hasn't been easy. It won't be easy in the future, but I think we've managed, I guess.
That's good to hear. The other thing is to learn how to say no to things. saying no to these random offers that, a few weeks ago, this one was like, I really want you to be on the board of my nonprofit. And it was really exciting and I really wanted to help her. But I said no because I said, if I do something, I give it my all. And I don't have the bandwidth right now. And I knew if I said yes, it's going to cost me sleep. It's going to cost me energy that I would be putting towards other things. So I've had to learn how to say no to kind of balance or just have some sort of work-life balance, even though, I am single, I don't have children, I don't have all those expectations and pressures that you're facing.
But different
still,
ones.
Yeah.
I have a really good idea on this. So a few weeks ago, I was asked to do something. I won't be specific because of, privacy of the other. But I was asked to do something which, like you were just describing, you're like, oh, I can see the, 15 reasons I should do this. But then I thought, okay, but I don't think I have the time. I really don't. And I was tortured, right? And I have to say, I went to a conference and we were sitting around a lunch table and I was describing this dilemma I was in, and it was like completely split down the middle. All of the men were like, oh, just say no. And then, like, they didn't think about it. They're like, oh, just say no. No big, what's for dessert, right? And the women were like, oh, I can totally see why you're tortured, and like, maybe you should do it. So then when I went home, I realized, like, wow, there is a gender dynamic to this saying no thing, and I'm on the female side. So I talked to one of my very good friends, Katie Milkman at Wharton, and she said, oh, well, you should be a member of the No Club. I said, well, what's the No Club? She's like, well, I have a few friends, all women professors, and when we feel like we don't really want to do something, we email each other, and then we let them, each other kind of give us encouragement and advice. So I emailed the No Club, and I said, well, here's my, choice, and they emailed right back, and they gave me the perfect thing to say, and they also, one of them said, if the answer isn't hell yes, the answer is hell no. And that also helped me. I was like, you're right. If I don't feel enthusiastic about it, I should say no. And then they told me how to do it. So one thing women can do is create a no club. It only takes another person. Of course, you could have 3 or 4. And when you're in this bind that I was in, email your no club, get advice from people that you really trust and respect. And I think they will help you, as I was enormously helped by the no club that, let me join.
Yeah, and also being self-compassionate, because I feel we feel this guilt that, oh, I should be, we're raised with this, I should always be helping other people, nurturing other people, and if you're saying no, it's like I'm, not giving them what I should be giving, and the shoulds kind of kick in.
Yeah.
So really being kind to yourself, that it's okay, you don't have to be there for everybody. You don't have to please everybody. You need to also take care of yourself.
Yeah, if Adam Grant were on this podcast, which, he would be a great guest for you, I'm sure, he would say that
I would love to speak with him.
Yeah, he's great. I love Adam. And some of his seminal research is that, you really want to be helping others and helping yourself. It's really not either or. And there are occasionally choices in life that you have to make that put these into conflict and then sometimes you have to choose self-preservation so that you can be a giver in the long run.
So how do you take care of yourself? Like self-care, I think, is one of the most important concepts that keep coming up when I work with women, because they really feel it's selfish if they take that time to go for a run, or if they make sure they get more sleep, but it's really a part of nurturing yourself so that you can have more to give. If you're an empty well, there's really not much to share.
I have, I'm 48 and a half, and I have somehow figured this out. I'm trying to think when I did, because I know when I was much younger, I felt guilty about taking time for myself, but I really don't now. I mean, I don't feel any guilt about taking time to go for a run. I would sleep as much as I could. I'm actually not a very good sleeper, so not sleeping isn't because I have to get up. It's more because I think I'm thinking too much at night. But when did I figure that out? I went to therapy once when I was in my early 40s, and I remember that my therapist said, I remember having this argument with my therapist because I said, when you get married, you make the other person happy, and then they make you happy. Like, that's what marriage is. It's like 2 jigsaw puzzle pieces. You fit perfectly together. And she said, no, you're wrong. When you get married, you still have to take care of yourself, and then your husband has to take, or, your husband, it could be a same-sex marriage or whatever, but your partner has to take care of themselves. And I just couldn't understand what my therapist meant for the longest time. And I was eventually convinced. And then it showed, up in my own life. And I kind of realized that she was really right, my therapist, that even though it seems like it's so strange, I mean, in a way, you have to take care of yourself. Only by doing that can you be giving, can you be loving, can you be in a meaningful relationship. And when I started out in my marriage, I just didn't get that. I was like, no, you should be interdependent. And I have found that taking care of myself and not feeling like it's my husband's responsibility to make me happy has made it paradoxically much easier for me to be there for him and to appreciate him. So I don't know where in the journey I kind of figured it out on the kind of self-care, exercise and health routine, but I know when I figured it out emotionally, and that was probably, in therapy several years ago.
I think that's something that a lot of really gritty people may struggle with. And I spent 4 years in living with Harvard undergraduates as an advisor, and they're the most gritty people I've ever met.
A lot of grit at Harvard.
And I would genuinely worry about some of my students. And do you think there's such a thing as being too gritty? And how, I'm sure there's a spectrum, and how can we, and too much focus on success and not enough on actually enjoying life and our well-being and our health and being enjoying the process, not just reaching the goal, but enjoying the journey. And how can we sort of encourage more of a balance?
I think so it's certainly possible that there's such a thing as too much grit, and that like 4 out of 4 is good, 4.5 out of 5 is good. Just like, but when you get to 5, you have a problem. I don't know. I haven't seen anything in my data to suggest that at the extremes people start suffering. But I think you're bringing up something which I would like to answer in the following way. I think it's not, to me, a worry when people are really gritty. It's a worry for me when they lack other things. So if you have grit in the absence of self-awareness, or grit in the absence of self-compassion, or grit in the absence of empathy, or grit in the absence of curiosity, I think it's less about having too much grit and having more about having not enough of something else. And for those Harvard undergraduates who, of course, like I was one, a very miserable one, and if you had been in my dorm, you would have worried about me. I cried a lot. I was very unhappy as an undergraduate. I was very hard on myself. I was very filled with shoulds and oughts. I think it took me I even wrote to Dear Abby. I wrote Dear Abby a letter telling her that I was so unhappy, and she said, you should get therapy. And I was like, oh, that's not helpful. But actually, she was right. And then and then, of course, it took me 2 more decades to actually take that advice. But I do think we should think about, developing into people and thinking about the many things that we would probably want to make sure is in our life. Some laughter, some friendship, some curiosity, some fun, some grit, some self-control. It's really that kind of multifaceted way of thinking about development that I think it's liberating. I mean, it sounds like you're just adding more things to the to-do list, but I think it is a much more balanced way of leading a life.
It's a holistic way. It's a holistic way of thinking. How can we be better, happier humans who can serve and be productive as we live and grow and evolve?
Right. Hashtag work in progress.
Hashtag work in progress. Yeah. Well, on that note, Angela, I want to thank you for your time. This has been so much fun.
I hope your podcast is wildly successful. I'm going to get to say I knew you when.
Thank you so much. It's an honor meeting you, and I look forward to staying in touch, and We'll see how this goes.
Yeah. You'd keep me posted.
I will, for sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Maliheh Paryavi podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter, and subscribe to my newsletter on my website for more inspiration and support. Until next time, be well and keep on shining.